With regards to today's agenda, I'll start with a brief overview of SHARE itself. Then I'll speak to the objectives of today, and then I'll pass it on to Nancy to speak to the alignment, and then Kevin will take the session after that. We'll have a couple of sessions of Q&A, of questions and answers, in between each of the sessions. So please feel free to save your questions, or you can put them in the chat box and we'll be monitoring them through there. So first, I'll just mention a little bit something about SHARE. As I noted, SHARE stands for Supporting Holistic and Actionable Research in Education. And we're the principal mechanism for doing primary research through USAID's Center for Education. So our first objective is to do targeted research that advances USAID's learning agenda and learning priorities. Our second objective overall and an outcome that we're trying to achieve and that we're working on within SHARE is focused on how we do the research. It's very important for us not to just do research that sits on a shelf, but to make sure that we're really engaging those who will ultimately use the research. So we involve them very early on in the process. So this outcome really focuses on strengthening and focusing on that engagement between those who generate research, translate it, and ultimately use it, really to help build this culture of evidence-based decision-making. And then our third outcome is to advance learning priorities and needs in the education space for individual USAID missions and bureaus. The objective of today's session is to provide many of you as researchers with, first of all, a framework to assist you in the analysis process, after you've done data collection, and to ensure alignment between the ultimate kind of the research questions, the findings that you identify from your research, any supporting evidence, and the recommendations that would be specific to the various target audiences that you may be speaking to through and wanting to focus on through your research. The second objective of today's session is to share with you a framework that can help develop a dissemination strategy more broadly to increase potential uptake of the recommendations for each target audience that comes and emerges out of your research. So with that, I will pass it on to my colleague, Nancy.
Hello.
And greetings, everyone. So as we're thinking through, I think somebody might need to mute their mic. Okay, perfect. As we're thinking through the analysis and writing process, really analysis and writing are very linked, as we all know. And so often it can be very helpful to have something similar. These analysis tables that I'm presenting are similar to an outline, but they help to kind of show your narrative link or your alignment between your research questions, your data source methods, the findings that you're going to present, and then the evidence you have to back it up. And this can be a great tool to use as you're coming up with, okay, these are the key findings I think I want to pull forward, and this is the evidence that I'm going to present. This could be these are nice tools to use to share with other members of your research team before you get through the writing an entire report or writing an entire findings section. This is a nice kind of low bar way to organize your writing in a way that clearly demonstrates how the findings that you're presenting address the research question and clearly demonstrates the evidence that you're going to bring forth to show those findings, to kind of back up your argument that this is the finding that I've made in relation to this research question. The other nice thing about it, if you see on the far, I think that would be your far right, it also, having the recommendations there can help you. Sometimes we have a lot of findings and maybe too much to fit into a nice, concise report to, for example, your funder. And so finding out which of those findings we really want to put forward in the main body of the report and which others maybe we'll put in an annex. One way to do that is to think, is there an actionable recommendation in relation to this finding that we really want to highlight? If it's some additional information that's nice to know, but maybe isn't directly related to the research question or directly an actionable piece of an actionable finding that can inform a recommendation, this can be a tool to help you narrow and really whittle down what is the really important information that I need to have in a short report that can be easily digested by our by our end users that we want to use our evidence. So I'm going to go through in the next slide. Do you mind switching to the next slide? Just a few examples of this. So the first one is from actually, all of these examples are from one study. We thought it might be nice to use the same study to make it easy to kind of wrap our heads around what are the research questions and what is the study about. So this study was looking at ways to improve the distribution of books in a low-income country. And so we were looking at a specific case study that showed a successful intervention to enhance book distribution, textbook distribution to schools and to students. And so this system's called Track and Trace, where the Ministry of Education and schools can first easily communicate over a digital platform for schools to indicate the number of books and which books they need for the next school year, and then for the Ministry of Education to quickly see across the entire country what is the demand for books, and then send those books out there, and then for schools to say we've received them and quickly kind of communicate back and forth via this digital platform. So one of the questions that we had were, what are the key characteristics and perceived impacts of this track and trace system? And this one example is looking at the second part of this question, what are the impacts of this system? So we spoke with a variety of different individuals, school directors, Ministry of Education officials, school support committees, folks who work at the non-governmental organizations who are part of implementing this system, and then publishers who are working to publish textbooks. And we talked to them through interviews and surveys. And one of the key findings that we pulled out was that the system is saving time and resources. So, and I'm going to share with you the supporting evidence that we presented in our report. So one of them is from an education official, and they explained, in the past, we might not yet have finished entering the data for about 10,000 schools by this time. But through Track and Trace, all data can be collected within a month. And then we can start calculating the total requested number of textbooks. So it is fast and timely. And then the other supporting piece of evidence that we're presenting here is from a school director who agrees. So we have two different stakeholder groups agreeing on this finding. Because we use electronic devices, information goes to the ministry faster, and the textbooks also arrive fast. So we're seeing a saving time, saving resources. We have some additional information, additional quotes that we present in the body of the report, talking a bit more about the saving resources, such as not needing to travel to deliver the forms, etc. And then the recommendation is pretty simple, that this system should continue to be supported by the Ministry of Education, that this has been an effective intervention, has saved people time and resources, and so it's valuable and we should continue to commit to it. And I guess kind of one thing I'll say, in this linear table, we start with the findings. Certainly in the analysis, we'll start with the evidence and then pull the findings from the evidence. But then when we're presenting our report, we'll want to lead with our findings. because that makes it easier for the reader to really pick up our narrative. We want to make it as easy as possible for those findings to stick out at people, especially because everybody these days is too busy and doesn't have a lot of time. And so if we can lead with these findings, but then make sure that we're presenting the evidence that's really backing that up, that's really helpful. So that's why we have it in this order here. And I just want, so here's another example. So, and the main thing that I wanted to emphasize from this slide is, especially with qualitative research, we want to spend, we'll emphasize what our key finding is, but we definitely want to spend time showing our supporting evidence. Like we want to show and not tell people our findings. So lead with the finding, but then provide plenty of backup evidence to kind of show them that. So the research question here, it's in the same study, a different research question within that study. What were the challenges what challenges were observed and addressed during the process of implementing the track and trace system? So this key finding was that there was a lack of internet connectivity in remote areas, and this was a barrier to implementation. And the supporting evidence that I've pulled out for this is one, I think this was from an education official. The location is not only in a remote place, not so many schools can afford to buy. Oh, this was actually from a school director. The location is not only in a remote place, not so many schools can afford to buy smartphones to use. We do not need the iPhone 13 Pro or so, but we cannot even afford to buy a normal Oppo yet, a budget smartphone. And then the second one is from an education official. First, school directors that are in remote areas are difficult to reach because of the lack of internet service. When they want to use a track and trace system, they have to travel to a place that has internet service. The expensive internet connection is covered by the school directors themselves. So there are a few issues around lack of connectivity that's a barrier to implementation, particularly in remote areas. So the recommendation then is that the Ministry of Education, with support from development partners, should ensure that schools have access to internet and a digital device so that they can use this. Now, I thought this last example from the same study we could work on together. So this is more the way that I would typically go about identifying my findings or recommendations, which is starting with the research question and the evidence. So once again, we're looking at what are the challenges that were observed and addressed during the process of implementing the track and trace system. And one piece of supporting evidence is that 38% of school directors that were reached in the online survey reported having received training on how to use the track and trace system. And then the second one is, so we have that quantitative piece of evidence, and then the second supporting piece of evidence is a quotation. I think we need more training, as so far there's only been one training for one of our staff and with school directors. Some have already retired and shifted to other schools. So do the school support committees and the District of Education. To be honest, even though I'm a director of the District of Education, I have not received any training yet. So like, what would be the key finding that we would want to lead with that relates to this research question around challenges observed? And would love it if people could just put their suggestions in the chat and we can kind of pull some out. Sorry, Kevin, I think you needed to move to the next slide. I apologize, I was on my own. I apologize. Okay, so this is the evidence you see here. One is 38% of school directors in the survey reported not having received a training. And then the next one is we need more training. A lot of school directors haven't received the training. Some have already retired who did. And then this director of the District of Education had not received any training yet. So what would be like, if people wouldn't mind just kind of putting in the chat the key finding that they would pull out from this. Yeah. So I agree with Joseph and Jennifer that we need to have more trainings on how to use this track and trace system is the key finding. And I think it clearly links to the evidence and the recommendations. Let's move to the next slide. So this is another example from the same study. And the question is the same. What were the challenges observed during the process of implementing the track and trace system? So the evidence we have first is, to date, we seem to depend too much on a foreign server company, and it's a huge expense. Now that we've already built the platform, there should be a study on whether we can switch the server company to a local one instead. So that's from an education stakeholder. And then the next one is, the company is too expensive for us. Our proposal to them for help to improve some of the little functions always costs about $10,000. Well, if we want to incorporate all of the functions or changes, it might cost about 200,000 more. We cannot afford that. The developing company is an international one. That is pricey. So, I mean, what would be looking at that supporting evidence, does anybody have any suggestions about like the finding that you would pull from this evidence and maybe also a recommendation? Either say it out loud or just add it to the chat. Yep, I agree with everybody. So, and this is kind of a nice example of the ways that our evidence can be a source of our recommendation. So our research participants are suggesting the way forward, and it's nice to be able to pull those recommendations from the very actors that we're interviewing. So I agree with everyone here that the external companies are too expensive, and working with a local company, now that a lot of the challenges of getting the platform up and running, working with a local company to then manage the server would just be a lot more cost effective and cost efficient for the Ministry of Education. And I like Dr. Noel help capacitate the local company so that they can offer affordable services. That's a great. So in addition to identifying a local company, if needed, we may need to strengthen capacity in certain areas, at least train them on the platform and how it's currently functioning, and then hand over to them to manage it from there. Okay, so now I think now we can open it up just to the Q&A for this section, and after this we'll continue with this example and the dissemination strategy phase, but opening it up. Maybe I'll just say one more thing. Another thing I like about using the analysis tables, I like to use them at the beginning of my studies as well. It's a resource that I actually pulled from a USAID template for writing your reports. And I've used it a lot in my inception reports or my study designs to kind of organize a narrative of how we plan to do the research. So we'll put out the research question, the data sources, the methods we'll use, and then in the finding section would be like, these are the indicators that we'll use to kind of answer the question, like basically trying to link that evidence that we're planning to gather to answer those research questions. And so it's also a nice tool to use at the beginning of the study as well, to just make sure that we've lined up our methods, our data sources, and the expectations of the evidence we'll be able to gather with the research questions. So it's kind of nice throughout. You can use it at the beginning when you're planning the research, and then you can use it as you're analyzing to give kind of a preliminary analysis and share with some of your study teams some of the findings that you're planning to write out, but you don't have to have it all written out before you can kind of share that preliminary analysis and get feedback. And then you can kind of work through whittling down, okay, these are really the findings we want to highlight before moving forward. And it also really helps you kind of do a pulse check of are the key findings that we're wanting to present really the best ones to present to answer the questions, and is the evidence supporting what we're saying?
Nancy, I had a question that I could throw out there.
Sure.
So in the example that you gave, when you think about crafting the recommendation, what data sources are you leaning on to think about like which audience you want to direct that recommendation towards? Is that also going to be, should that also be included in the table, or where can teams pull that piece of it from?
For identifying the target audience? Yeah, so you can, so in an earlier iteration of this presentation, I actually had a column for target audience as well. So, and that can help you kind of further specify your recommendations. I ended up taking it out just because of lack of space on the slide. But so for example, I was just writing in the recommendation, including the target audience. So I said something like, the Ministry of Education, with support from development partners, should continue to support the track and trace system. But if you specify it by target audience, you can kind of specify the recommendation a bit more, like what support would development partners provide versus Ministry of Education, et cetera. But it's a nice thing to have. And then in terms of the recommendations, I often, so a couple of the sources that you can use to kind of think through what recommendations you might suggest. One is directly citing your research participants and saying, research participants are overwhelmingly emphasizing that the need for a local firm to be the ones managing the platform to reduce the cost. So that can be one of the ways that you pull up your recommendation. Another can just be doing more literature reviews and kind of providing an evidence-based recommendation on what's been done in other contexts that seems comparable to our context that could be used here to answer the challenge that's been identified. Over.
Just a reminder, if people have questions, they can enter them in the chat box or just voice them. And Nancy, we have a question from Michelle, which says, how can you ensure the lifelong process of learning using digital book platforms, since AI is already integrated in learning? And based on your research, how can you implement this type of modality in teaching using digital transformations? So it's actually a specific question around the study, as opposed to the topic of alignment of findings and recommendations and how to communicate them.
Yeah, this is a great question. It's out, I mean, to be fully honest, it's outside of the scope of my expertise. So I don't want to pretend to know the best use of digital platforms for teaching and learning. But I would direct people to a nice online platform it's a repository of studies and kind of briefers on the use of digital technology in education. It's called EdTech Hub, and it's funded through the UK Aid Agency. So I can put it in the chat, but they've got lots of really nice studies that show different ways that technology can be used to support learning. Sometimes it can be used in ways to support inclusion of learners with disabilities. There are some different technologies that have been used to support learning during, for example, a COVID pandemic or other crises or shocks that interrupt learning. Some technologies are, and I think one thing that I would suggest is also, and this is actually something that came from this report, is the importance of using platforms that are widely used in the country. So in some cases, maybe that's radio or television. And in some cases, maybe like WhatsApp is very widely used. So just making sure you're using a platform that people are familiar with in the country is a good starting point. And that was something that came out from the study as well. I don't know, Tom or Kevin, if you had anything you wanted to add about that.
I wish I could predict the impact of AI on things. It would be $1 million question. But
Yeah.
no, similarly for me, I think it's outside my area of expertise. It's a great question though, Michelle.
Yes. And I concur, and I did include a link to the EdTech Hub, and I see that Michelle's already seen it, so thank you. Other questions?
Maybe, sorry, I'm talking a lot, but I just wanted to say one more thing. As a bit more background on these analysis tables, they've been a great tool for us. So at the University of Notre Dame, we work with researchers across the globe. And we are kind of often co-PI, so we co-lead research studies together and engage in the analysis together. And so using these analysis tables have been a helpful way to share our preliminary analyses with each other, especially when we're not working in the same geographic location, to be able to share something that you didn't have to spend a lot of time writing like paragraphs and paragraphs. You could just say, this is the finding I want to highlight. This is the evidence that I would present. And this is how it's linked to the research question and like an actionable recommendation. It's just a nice tool to share data back and forth. And I wanted to emphasize it in terms of research teams, because I think it can be really helpful if you've got a global research team working in different institutions completely. And so it's just a little harder to be co-writing in the same location. Over.
Okay, well, I guess if there's no more questions, should we progress to the next section?
Sure.
Okay. And then just to mention Nancy's analysis table, she's adding a resource to a public Google Drive folder that we'll share at the end of the presentation, so you can access them and you can apply them as needed. So we're going to transition now to speaking about research dissemination. Again, well, not again, I think it's the first time I'm speaking. So what is it? Or introducing myself. My name is Kevin Mann. I'm a policy impact specialist at the Pulte Institute for Global Development. So I work a lot on the research dissemination across all of SHARE's studies. There's quite a few studies under SHARE. You know, we mentioned Libros Cambodia. There's also Libros Honduras and Libros Rwanda, all looking at book supply chains. And then there's also a cross-country study that looks at all of those. So SHARE has multiple multi-country studies and then single country studies. So it's a lot of organizing dissemination across all these different things. And how do we stay consistent, and how do we have a semblance of order in a study that large? So the spirit of this presentation is to think about bringing the alignment that Nancy spoke about in the analysis portion forward to dissemination. How can we carry the same kind of logic there? And then just to reiterate it here, the session objective for this half is to provide researchers or other applicable audiences with a framework to develop a dissemination strategy to increase potential uptake of recommendations by target audiences. So with SHARE, obviously, we've developed a framework that tries to meet the needs across all these different studies, but the framework I also think is applicable to single studies that you might be implementing. So the dissemination agenda about what we're going to speak about. First, we're going to talk about the key elements of a dissemination strategy. So when I first started learning about dissemination, I'd go on to Google and I would search research dissemination. What do I do? Help me. And I would find a bunch of this gray literature and policy papers, and they all had similar elements, but they didn't really tell me how to organize them. So the second thing we're going to speak about is how to go about prioritizing what should come first in a dissemination strategy. Then we're going to dig a little bit deeper on audience. Audience is a really tricky topic. It keeps me up at night, but it's important to structure dissemination strategy in a way that you can capture various types of audiences. Then we're going to just briefly touch on how you would actually go about capturing a dissemination strategy. So we've adapted 2 tools that we use at Share and removed all the Share stuff from them. So they're, readily adaptable to whichever needs you might have. So I'm just going to present those and then maybe mention some common issues and helpful tips and save some time for questions. And if you have any questions at any point, you can throw them in the chat. I'll do my best to monitor it, and we can. All right. So just before we get started, there's one little flag that I have to plant. It's that this idea, this framework, is a post-findings dissemination strategy. So broadly speaking, in dissemination, we have pre-findings and post-findings, right? Pre-findings is before those analysis tables start to be populated that Nancy spoke about. Pre-findings generally are a little bit more straightforward, right? The dissemination strategy there. It's, we might have a good idea of who the target audiences are going to be. For Share, it's usually always USAID and Ministry of Education. They're usually always up there at the top. But we don't have any specific actions that we want to direct them towards yet, right? We haven't crafted those recommendations out of the analysis table that Nancy has produced. So it's more just, our research is important, it's interesting, look to us in the future for more information at such and such date, so on and so forth. Post findings is when we're actually operationalizing these recommendations that we've crafted and trying to bring them to fruition and adoption. And to that point, findings and evidence in this case mean data, so the actual data points. So, student test scores increased by 30%. That's a finding or a piece of evidence. Recommendations mean the suggested actions based on that data. I'll kind of plug it a few times, but one of the underlying messages of this is, as an organization, I think everyone should go through the process of defining what these terms mean for them, so that way everybody's on the same page. Because like I said, you can read 10 different papers and get 15 different opinions on like what each of these words means. So you have to get on the same page as an organization in a few different ways. Okay, so I want to start off with a quick question and ask you to put your answers in the chat in the next 30 seconds. So what are the key elements of a dissemination strategy? I mentioned that I Googled dissemination strategy and a bunch of things came up. Objectives came up, audience, communication ideas. So what are the buzzwords that come to mind for you? If I said, list out all the words you can think of associated with dissemination strategy. And I'm going to watch the chat and hopefully we'll get a few answers in there. But yeah, take 30 seconds now to do that. So awesome. Nancy got us start off with audience and publications. Nice. Alternatively, if you can't type, you can also unmute and just and call it out to me. Stakeholders, thank you, Phyllis. Appreciate you. Outreach to audience, nice. Okay, getting some good answers. Pamela, channels, platforms, nice. Wonderful. Network, communication, audience, channels, relationships. Yeah, these are all potentially right, right? And I'm sure you've seen them written down in a policy document somewhere. For our purposes today, these are the words that I work with kind of on a daily basis. Posters, right? I'm seeing some more coming. I don't want to leave any behind. Engagements with audience. Yeah, posters, that would fall under knowledge products for us in this case. So objectives, audiences, communication ideas, knowledge products, events, findings or evidence, and recommendations. So these are the words that I utilize in our dissemination strategy day to day. So I'd like us to focus in on specifically these. These might capture some of the things that we were saying, like knowledge products would capture posters in this case. Second question, putting you guys to work. What should come first? So if you're sitting down to write a plan, which of these should be the guiding light or the North Star? What do you want to follow in this? Do you want to put the audience first and let that drive the rest of the plan? Do you want to put the events or the objectives first? All right, so Maria says objectives. Pamela says audience. See if there's objectives, audience. Okay, so there's I wish we had a bit of a poll. It's neck and neck for objectives and audience. Objectives. Nice. Objectives first. Events. Right? And kind of what might be happening now for you is you're thinking about it logically, right? You're thinking about how am I going to solve this problem? And you're trying to play out what makes the most sense to come first, right? What's the first domino that I'm going to flick? And that's really like this is one model that you could potentially use, but that is really the key message here is that you and your organization can sit down, you can have that conversation where you think about what are the key things, like where should we start this? What makes the most sense? Adapting it to your context. So we're going to speak about one model, and I just want you to kind of remember that kind of like thought process that you're going through and potentially bring it back to your organization. It's a great way to get started with dissemination planning. So in Nancy's segment, we spoke about alignment in the analysis portion. So thinking about what research questions do we have, what data sources do we have, findings and evidence, keeping them all in a line and driving towards a recommendation. Recommendations are really, really wonderful and powerful dissemination tools because they contain an audience and communication idea inherently. So in the example that Nancy gave about the local servers being really expensive, or the international servers being really expensive for Libros Cambodia, we might have a recommendation potentially that reads, based on the findings of Libros Cambodia, the Cambodian Ministry of Education should contract Cambodian-based servers for TNT web traffic, right? So inherently inside of a recommendation, we have an audience and we have a communication idea. So my question was a little bit of a trick one in terms of like how I'm presenting this, because they actually kind of come together if we let recommendations drive through from analysis, produce the recommendation. We let the recommendation then drive the effort afterwards. So like I said, recommendations contain communication ideas, and they also contain an audience that you are directing the communication idea towards. Communication idea is the action that you're seeking, and then the audience is who you want to take that action in this case. Under communication ideas is where I would put the findings and the evidence. We also call them rationale to kind of distinguish them a little bit in this case. Communication idea, if we boil it down to something simple like, I'm trying to convince you to buy a car, right? All of a sudden I work for Toyota and I would like every one of you to buy a Toyota Prius, right? Now, Nancy alluded to this, that we go through a multi-year study and we have a mountain of data and a mountain of evidence, quotes on quotes and regression tables and, everything. There's a lot of it. So if I'm going to try and sell you a Toyota Prius, I'm not going to start citing the meticulous details, which might be useful for a very select few part of the audience, or a very select few who might read the report. Like I'm not going to talk about, the ideal pressure in the tires, or the plastic in the dashboard, or the width of the chair, right? Those are all data points about it, but they're not applicable to the communication idea, which is, you should buy the car. Why should you buy the car? The general person or my target audience, you should buy it because the Toyota Prius has amazing gas mileage, it's affordable, and it's safe, right? So these three pieces of evidence from our study rise to the top to support it the best. So I just dwell on that a little bit because it's such an important thing that you want to let the evidence kind of speak. You don't want it to get lost in the mountain of it, right? You want to identify the pieces that speak the most to your communication ideas. Out of that, we want to think about what events and knowledge products make the most sense. So I noticed that when we were doing the chat exercise, I don't think anybody said like knowledge products should come first, right? And that's because logically it doesn't necessarily make sense, right? You want to think about what's my objective, what am I trying to achieve, and then does it make sense to make a targeted policy brief? Does it make sense to do a podcast series? Does it make sense to do meetings with the teachers unions, right? Like whatever it might be, teacher unions being an event, we want to let this stuff up top drive what happens afterwards. And so in this sense, the objective is the successful delivery of this basket of information to the target audience. You know, if the objective of the study is to improve the book supply chain, how are you going to do it? You're going to do it by delivering these recommendations, communication ideas, really strong evidence to the right people. So you want to let these guide the dissemination strategy, and these at the bottom in the red box, events and knowledge products, these should grow out of the best way to reach your audience and achieve your objectives. And just a quick flag to plant. I'm saying should in this model, right? Should if it makes sense for your context. So take should with a grain of salt and always ensure that the logic makes sense in your particular context. Again, this is one model and it can be adapted as needed, but there's a logic to it nonetheless. Now, I also want to pause here and just speak about audience for a second, because audience is like one of the most difficult things ever. In preparation for this event, we were speaking a lot about audience, and each kind of go round and round, and you don't really know if you ever really have it pinned down, right? And an example of this is like, it would be a really fair question if you said, you know, Kevin, what if the target of a recommendation is strongly influenced by a different audience? So an example, right? It's great if you can speak directly to the Minister of Education in Cambodia, but what if you know from your stakeholder mapping and your evidence ecosystem exercises that the Ministry of Education is actually really, really strongly influenced by this certain think tank and by the National Teachers Union, right? Like those two groups exert the most pressure and most influence. In that case, we capture them as influencers, right? They aren't the audience in this sense because they're not the person that's going to be like signing the bill and they're the person that's ultimately the decision maker in the matter, but they apply an influence on them. And the communication idea to them is pretty much the same, right? It's that the Ministry of Education should get a local server, right? It's just that they're trying to convince the Ministry of Education now too, but we have to do the same work, use the same evidence to convince them of the feasibility and the strength of the idea. I see a question emerging in the chat and some other things, so let's just I want to make sure that we capture those and can return to them during the Q&A section.
I'm capturing them.
Forget about you. Thanks, Tom. Okay, so then the next question is, how do we actually go about capturing this information, right? It's all great in theory, but how do you actually start to operationalize it and use it? We have two documents, two tools that we use that I think are the most useful for this exercise. So the first one is a dissemination planning document. This captures the high-level strategy. It captures, here it is right here. I took a screenshot. Everything that we discussed about here, the objectives, recommendations, communication ideas, target audience, so on and so forth, at a high level for the study. The why, like I was just saying, map out key elements. You ensure alignment between teammates, partners, and studies, if applicable, right? So like, if you're managing multiple studies, this stuff becomes doubly important, right? Because the team in Cambodia might be developing a dissemination plan in a different way than the team in Honduras, as opposed to the team in Rwanda, right? Or the Libros team, which is about book supply chain, might be developing a totally different dissemination strategy compared to the Lights team. The Lights team that does language of instruction stuff. So in terms of like getting a bird's eye view and having a strategy for everything, you have to use consistent terms and you have to use consistent documents. So that's part of why I've been like plugging, like sit down and figure out what words like make sense for you and sit down and define them and have really clear definitions for everything and have consistent documents designed based on those definitions. So this document basically captures everything that's here. I don't want to go into it in extreme detail because I kind of already told you everything. And I don't want to bore you, but I'll go briefly through the sections. So study overview. This is just a brief 1 to 2 paragraphs where you can provide the reader with just a really quick onboarding of what the study is about. Why do we do this? The reason is so, say you're working with a funder like USAID, they might have a staff change or they might be working with somebody in a new mission, you don't know. they can very quickly enter this document and get oriented to what's happening, right? Studies are long. They last multiple years, right? So what is it? Keeping these consistent descriptions, objectives, and so on as we do this is really important to bring people on board and to inform them. The other reason it's important, and this goes for everything in this document, is if you have a communications team at your organization, eventually you're going to get an email from the communications team that's like, can you write me some copy for this study, right? And I've worked partly on the communications team, so I know how frustrating it can be as if you're on the communications team, you need like 3 sentences, right? But you can't just write 3 sentences. You have to read the research design, read the reports, try and figure this stuff out. You're always kind of taking a bit of a shot in the dark when you're not intimately familiar. So you create these resources as an organization, there's a big efficiency gain because it's already approved copy. It was drafted by the research team. They're like, this is what the study's about. Communications team can enter the document and take this information and run with it. So that's just like a little bit of like a side bonus that you get with with this approach. But returning to the document at hand, so you have a study overview, you have the objectives, recommendations here. Then we have target audience and influencers, communication ideas, along with the rationale for those communication ideas. And then at the bottom, see the same thing, right? The knowledge products and the events grow out of what all that other stuff is. What's the best way to reach this audience? What's the best way to package this information, right? You might be required to do a technical report and a policy brief. What else can you do? Or is there any room for lateral movement in how you design that policy brief? Can you design kind of multiple iterations that are more targeted? Questions of that nature. And then at the bottom, definitions, like the most exciting stuff ever. It can be dry stuff, but it's also super important. And the conversations can be very rewarding organizationally when you actually go in and you think about what does it mean when we actually say findings and evidence, and what does it mean when we say recommendations or objectives, so on and so forth. So these are my definitions that I drafted. But again, I encourage you as an organization to go through and make sure you're on the same page about what you mean when you write all these different things. So that's this document. Examples are in pink using the Cambodia example. I can go through it if there's more specific questions, but I want to leave time for a lot of Q&A at the end in case I can answer anything specific that might be on your mind. Looks like we're doing pretty good on time though. The next document is communication memo. So communication memo is for event planning specifically. So in the previous document, we thought about what is the general dissemination strategy? What do we hope to achieve? What are our objectives? It's going to come to a certain point when a specific event needs to be planned. And one of the main reasons that we do this, I'll skip to the second bullet point, is that it ensures all events are being planned in a way which places the study objectives and target audiences above the event planning, right? So for SHARE, for example, there's always this in-country dissemination event requirement or expectation. So Libros Cambodia, they have to have some kind of an event in Cambodia where they're disseminating their findings. But there's a ton of room for creativity and design in terms of what that event actually looks like. So you don't want to go in thinking, again, letting the events drive, you want to let the objectives and things drive. So if we're trying to communicate this thing about the servers or whatever the recommendations are, what's the best way to reach the policymakers, our audience, or the influencers? Is it a one-day workshop? Is it a 2-day workshop? Is it something else more creative than a 1 or a 2-day workshop? So there are a lot of different options in terms of what you actually ultimately do for these events. And going through this process will tell you if the scope of your event, is matching the scope of your objectives and your communication ideas. If you start with the event, then you're going to constrain your objectives and you're going to alter them. So that's the other why. The first one is that it ensures alignment between the specific event and the dissemination strategy of the study, right? So a lot of these categories, objectives, target audiences, and so on, they're the same as the dissemination strategy document we just saw. So we've already drafted that information. We're just going to pull the pieces that make the most sense for this particular event that we're planning. Then lastly, the other why is that it ensures alignment between the team on event objectives. So actually sitting down and being like, what do we actually hope to achieve from this event is a really key thing, because until you sit down and put it in writing and speak about it, you can have two wildly different ideas. And normally there's more than two people on a team. So it can be even more of a confusing situation than that. But getting on the same page makes content creation afterwards much, much easier. Because if you have the objectives, we can just, like, we had an objective slide. Where did those objectives come from? They came from this document. Nancy and I sat down and we said, what do we hope to achieve from this? And we drafted them. We pull that right in, and then the rest of the content creation just follows that guiding light. So I'll click this one as well. Again, these are going to be in the Google Drive folder that's being shared at the end, so you can access them and engage with them as you see fit. But again, we have study overview, pulling in the same information. Here we can clarify whether it's pre or post findings event. That might be an important distinction, because obviously you can't carry findings through if it's a pre-findings event. Then we have the objectives, the audiences, communication ideas with rationale, along with an event description at the bottom of it. Again, the event description emerges because of this pre-work that we're doing, thinking about what do we want to achieve, right? So that's that document. Hopefully these explanations in here are clear. I think that they are. It's very similar to everything I've been speaking about so far. The two most common pieces of feedback, a lot of my job is receiving these communication memos and then reviewing them and providing feedback to teams in different locations and different situations. The first one is to always push for more specificity in your audiences. Try and be as specific as possible. So sometimes I'll see like development agencies as a bullet point for the audience. Which development agencies, right? Funders, which funders? If you put Ministry of Education, can you push it even further and be more specific? Are there sub offices from the Ministry of Education that will be attending? Can you even identify individuals, right? There's really no negative impact from going deeper into an audience analysis. All it does is it just makes you more aware of the evidence ecosystem you're trying to influence ultimately. So always pushing towards the next level of specificity there is one piece of feedback that I give. And then the second one is that in our model, your communication ideas are your recommendations. Just bring them over. You know what I mean? You spent all this time trying to create this research, which is going to positively impact the book supply chain, and you came up with these ideas on how to do it. Let's communicate those. Don't only communicate the findings and then get them, and then the message is lost, right? It's lost, or it's up to the interpretation of the audience. You want the audience to play an active role in terms of like, how would we actually go about this? They would need to, right? If they actually wanted to contract local servers, they would need to engage with that process. They'd gain some ownership over it there. But the delivery of like what the actual recommendation is, that's the thing that we've been driving towards throughout all the analysis. So we want to just tell them what it is, So that's the communication memo. Coming to near the end, common issues and helpful tips. This first one, I've already mentioned a few times, have clear definitions. Be on the same page about everything. It can be really helpful to just sit down and just, what are the key elements, right? The first thing that we did was we asked, what are the key elements in the chat? You can do the same thing with your team. What are the key elements of a dissemination strategy? Put them on paper. What do they mean to us, right? And how are we going to use them? You do that step, and then the clarity of communication that can emerge afterwards it's massively improved. Be as specific as possible with audience. I just mentioned that one, so we're all good there. Sharing recommendations is the objective of a targeted dissemination effort. This is pretty much just the theme of everything. I just wanted to reiterate it. When research translation is aligned, again, the findings drive towards specific recommendations. But I think you get the message. I've said it a few times. Then the fourth one, this one is interesting to me. And we haven't really fully implemented it in Share yet, but I'm excited to. I'm excited to explore it a little bit more. Recommendations, apart from like telling you the audience and the communication idea, they can also be used as impact metrics. So my job title is policy impact specialist. So I'm always kind of like thinking a little bit of my brain in terms of like how do we roll policy impact into this? If you have 8 recommendations which emerge from a study, you can just make a spreadsheet with those 8 recommendations. And then when you convene your stakeholders in the future or whatever, that can be a guiding part of your agenda to say, like, listen, has there been any movement that you've heard about in terms of like recommendation 1, right? That's the first column is a recommendation. Second column is, has there been any movement? Yes, there has. Your organization just captured a piece of impact, right? So the fulfillment of recommendations can become policy impact metrics. Impact metrics are super, super messy, and it's a subject of like a whole nother conversation. But in my mind, that's something that I'm kind of excited about and thinking about for the future, is operationalizing these in another way. A lot of shared like research is concluding right now, so we're getting a lot of recommendations. So it should be something we can test out in the future. And I think that brings us to the end, and we're ahead of time, so we can give you all some time back in your day, unless we have 30 minutes worth of questions. But I think we definitely have some questions. So let's go through those. And I'll take a drink of water because there's a lot of talking.
So, one of the questions that came up from Atanasio was around how can we ensure that our research is accessible to vulnerable and marginalized people within societies. And I put a lot of links in the chat, but I wanted to just emphasize the last one, because I was trying to find it earlier. This knowledge translation workbook is a really nice resource. And basically, among the things that it highlights is something that we're doing with Share from the beginning, kind of thinking through. If you scroll down a little bit more, keep going. Keep going. There's some opportunities to kind of think through your own position, but keep going down. Keep going down. Keep going down. Keep going down. This one here. Oh, back up. Question 5. No, keep going down. Sorry. Let me. I want to pull it up. Find it on my side. One of the things that they talk about is from whose. Yeah. Okay, wait. Let me look on my screen. Page 13. Okay, whose point of view is reflected? Okay, whose point of view is reflected in defining the problem? And then and then question 10, what are the information gaps in the problem area? Those are kind of 2 key great starting points, especially, early in the research, you should be thinking about who are the target audiences for this research. Like, who do you want to be able to use this research? And then you should be engaging them from the start. So what is the problem from their standpoint, and kind of getting a sense of what are their research objectives. So I think that would be kind of step 1 in terms of making sure that the research is accessible, is making sure that the kind of the problems that they're interested in are captured in the research questions. And then, there's certainly some of the other resources that I put in as well, kind of talk through readability, kind of using plain language in your communications efforts, thinking through like what are for example, in Uganda, where I live, there are local councils. And sometimes there are like local council meetings. Is that a functioning space where communities are meeting and talking? And would that be a space then to work within existing kind of community structures to share findings, something like that? So you're also certainly wanting to like get a sense of very contextually what are the existing structures that are functioning in the community, and how might we best plug into those. And another thing I guess I'll just quickly say is that we also use advisory boards for our research as part of Share, and they do a good job of kind of helping us think through some of the questions that Kevin was talking about, around like who are the influencers for our audience, and what are the best channels or ways to kind of reach the end users of our study, as well as like their potential influencers. Maybe I'll stop there. Over.
No, that's wonderful, Nancy. Thank you so much. The other thing that I was going to say, first thought that came to mind is that there's also the potential in this model, right, that we spoke about. There's a potential to include secondary audiences, which might be the term that you use, which are, beneficiaries of the study who don't necessarily have a direct influence on the adoption of the policy or the adoption of the recommendation that you're giving. Obviously, it's crucial also to disseminate information across those communities, especially if those communities are the target of the recommendation, right? Then it rolls a little bit more into kind of what Nancy was speaking about, is how do we reach these communities specifically? So the audience is kind of in the driver's seat in terms of where you end up directing your attention. But you can kind of always capture that outer ring, which emerges based on like if you're doing a recommendation-centric approach. So those were just my
we have a
thoughts
few
there.
more questions in the chat box. So there was another question from Atanasio, which Nancy also, I think, started to address, which is how do researchers ensure that their research is being accessible to vulnerable or marginalized people within societies?
Yeah, I mean that's the other it's similar, right? It's a similar question. Again, I mean, I think that if that is one of the key priorities of the study, then the dissemination of the finding that has to be included as one of the key objectives that you want to achieve. They have to be an audience that you want to disseminate to, and then you have to go through this process of thinking about what's the best way to reach them. So you both have to do the stakeholder mapping of identifying who the populations are, who the individuals and groups are, and then you have to go through the process of including them as a key audience in your plans, adapting these tools as they make sense for the context of the study, and thinking about the best ways to reach them. But normally what I say to questions like that, because they're wonderful questions, but I'm not smart enough to answer them, is that the context drives so much of it. And I'm not a context expert on the studies that I'm working on. I'm working on them at this latter stage of research dissemination, even though research dissemination ideally is embedded throughout the process. I'm not as much of an expert on the Libros Cambodia situation as a principal in Cambodia, right? So leaning on them to do the stakeholder mapping and working with them and letting the creativity emerge and the contextual expertise emerge about how to do those things. I think there was a question at the very end from, not at the very end, but the very bottom from Sutherland, that potentially Tom or Nancy could speak more to. Please explain more about how you identify stakeholders and the link to communicating. So the identification of stakeholders, I think, has to do with some of the ecosystem mapping, and I know that's other work that's done on Share, but it's done upstream from my work. So Tom, did you want to jump in there to offer your thoughts?
Yes. So the process that we used, which we found worked pretty well, was at the start of the study, identifying right away who are some of the principal actors that would be involved. And that was, it's fairly easy to identify some initial actors, whether they be at the government level, in our case, maybe people at USAID, potentially other researchers. And then we did go into a process of carrying out some quick interviews with individuals to understand where potential connections might be and who else should be involved in the process. Then we did convene a number of these actors together and identified through that process even more kind of a broader mapping of actors to see who may have been left out of that initial convening, and then communicated with them overall. And really, especially trying to understand the relationships between some of these actors, who might be in a position to influence others, who might be in a position to in kind of decision making and what level of decision making within institutions itself. Also, for example, within the government, there's a minister, but who might be assisting that minister in the decision that he or she is making. And so really understanding more and more about how these actors map out is important. And there's no formulaic way to do it, as opposed to just really having conversations and doing an analysis of what this mapping really looks like. There was also another question from Jennifer asking, where does a communications team come into this workflow? We are often not a part of the front end planning, but need to create reliable knowledge products from the findings. How can a communications team be better integrated?
Great question, Jennifer. For those of you who don't work on Share, Jennifer works with Pulte as well. So the challenge of integrating the communication team is super difficult. I don't think it's super difficult. I think it's surmountable. It can be solved, but it's difficult given the time constraints and time pressures that everyone is under. The model that I shared is a post findings model, but I'm a big fan of placeholders and doing as much pre-work as possible, bringing your dissemination strategy as far as you can, and then saving space for stuff that you know is going to come in the future. So ideally, you should have a pre-findings dissemination strategy as well, where you have identified, the objectives laid out in your research design and your target audiences and those things. Like I said, that's a little bit more of a straightforward process. It shouldn't take very long to develop that document. And again, the development of that document, it's great to onboard folks like funders or partners that might not be intimately familiar with the work right away, but it's also really, really helpful internally. I mentioned that briefly that the comms team can pull the information that they need right away. But if you develop that basic pre-findings dissemination strategy early on, add it to one of the documents, right? It's probably not going to be perfect the first time, but it's going to be better than not having a place to direct people towards, and it will improve if it's roundtabled by the people on your team, where you think mindfully about what do we actually want to capture here to be able to be readily shared out internally and externally. So the creation of a document like that would be very helpful at the beginning. So that way comms teams can be onboarded. The other way that comms teams can be onboarded is by sharing the knowledge products which you are aware of and are contractually obligated to be produced. So that's kind of a really wordy answer. So I'll say it in simpler terms. In Share, there's an expectation that every study produces 3 documents as part of the USAID cooperative agreement. First one is a technical report. That's your big, long report with all the findings and everything. The second one is a policy brief. It's a shortened 2 to 4 page document that captures the recommendations in a succinct and stylized way. And then the last one is a slide deck, which emerges from a presentation given to the USAID mission at the end. So there's these 3 things that we know will be produced. We know we're going to have to produce them, right? So the comms team should be made aware of any of these that ultimately will be produced, so that way they can have them on their radar. They can also do the same kind of placeholder game, develop them as far as they can, right? Create the document in Canva or in InDesign or whatever the program is that you're using to develop it, Google Docs, get the formatting set up. So that way, as a project team, you're not just staring at a blank Google Doc, right? And then where do I start, right? So the development of those things, everybody carrying the baton as far as they can forward at every possible point is the ideal situation of comms integration, I think. And then Pamela also said the comms team can also monitor and disseminate the progress of the research project to stakeholders. Yeah, absolutely. Right. There's all these progression points, milestones that the study goes through. We can share those out as well in order to drum up interest, in order to play the pre-findings game as well as we can. And then obviously if the milestones are being reached post findings, we can do it there as well. Quick little social media updates, posts, cool findings from the field. Really, it's only limited by the creativity on your team. Were there any other questions that I missed in the chat? I see a really lot of a lot of great points from folks. And I think it would probably be helpful when we share out the materials afterwards, if we can get a transcript of the chat with some of these links that have been shared.
There's a question from June Lin right now. What are your
Oh.
tools to assess the effectiveness of the dissemination strategy you have employed?
Yeah, June Lin, that's the question. That's what I was thinking about with the policy impact here. The recommendations can be used as impact metrics for your organization. The current tools that Pulte uses are they're fairly subjective and they're self-assessments usually for like at the researcher level. The researcher thinks about what are the different impact activities that occurred in the past year, and then they describe them kind of like on a one-off basis. But it's an imperfect system because it relies on individuals to report them. For studies, we have these ecosystem advisory groups that we continually engage with. They're like contextual experts that have been convened for each study, and help with stakeholder mapping and things like that. So it's one of the main topics that you can speak about, like when they get convened afterwards, like post-study, you can revisit them. You can use the recommendations as a guiding framework for that agenda, like I mentioned. Have you heard about anything happening in any of these regards? Or you can, you just roundtable it generally. Have there been other effects of the study that we, weren't necessarily going for, but are occurring, and capturing the notes from those conversations? But it's like half journalism and half monitoring and evaluation. It's a really kind of tricky area, but it's a great question, and it's one that I am also thinking about all the time.
And I see that Sutherland shared some resources from the RTAC community, translating and disseminating existing research, a guide to RTAC's, RTAC, which is the research communicating, RTAC's research communicating products, and RTAC stands for Research Technical Assistance Center. Thank you, Sutherland.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Tom, I don't know if you also wanted to speak to, I believe that one of our colleagues, Paul Perrin, had also developed an assessment for tracking impact for USAID. You know what I'm talking about?
No.
Okay, I can follow up on it and try and share when we share out the drive.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? I might add one point about the question related to how to reach some of the marginalized and vulnerable people within societies. And the suggestion would be true of really thinking about how to reach any potential audience, but the more we understand about a specific audience and how they receive information, who they speak with, can really help us target and look at really powerful ways to reach them. So perhaps they use their phones and are constantly receiving messages on SMS or through social media, or perhaps they're they have access to schools or hospitals, where they're receiving basic services. Or maybe they go to marketplaces or frequent other areas where there could be crowds and just kind of understanding the people who they interact with. So the one challenge is always to try to do this efficiently and economically, because none of us have the resources usually to speak and communicate with every audience that's out there. But potentially thinking about what are some of those venues or those forums where they go to consume information, and then how do you target a message through those mediums to see how best to make sure that that society or that community is able to access your messaging. Another one that we've used in the past are churches or faith-based institutions, and seeing how they can communicate messaging depending on the message itself to their constituencies, if that's relevant. So again, just thinking about how information is received among these different audiences. Okay.
Oh, sorry, Brooke. I was just going to highlight this stuff in my last slide. That's okay. And then I can
Yeah, go
pass it
ahead.
over to you. No, thank you. Sorry. I was just going to say that the resources can be found on the link there, which you can't click, but will be shared out. And then they can also be found at the link that I just copied into the chat. If you have additional questions or want to connect, I would encourage you to reach out to our email, share@nd.edu. And also you can sign up for Share's mailing list if you are interested. We send out a quarterly newsletter, and we're just, like I said, we're finishing a lot of studies right now, so there's a lot of topics coming out. And actually, let me just get the link for that as well, and I will put that into the chat. Just give me 1 second. Here you go. So you can sign up for Share's mailing list there. Okay. Thank you guys so much. I'll pass it over to Brooke.
Yeah, great. I have nothing else to add to that. So thanks everyone. And we will share the recording and all the links shared in the chat today with everyone after this event. So thanks everyone and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.